You have wonderful projects to work on.
Well, shall we go ahead?
I'm ready when you are.
Okay.
You know.
Well, I'll just give a very brief introduction then. So I've known Margot for several years. She was the deputy director of the John Carter Brown Library. She studied art history, and during her tenure at the JCB, brought an art historical perspective to the Agnese Atlas at the JCB, which is exactly what it had always needed. And she gave a talk about her research at the JCB, which was wonderful. And then she's been so busy with her new job at RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, as the Dean of Libraries there, that she hasn't had a chance to publish this work. So this is a wonderful opportunity for us to benefit from her research. And Rodrigo will be recording the talk in case, I think there are a few people who, particularly Paolo, who really want to hear this, who can't quite make it here. So with that, I think I'll give the word to you, Margot, and you can share your screen and we'll get started.
Thanks so much. And I'll leave my virtual background up for just a minute while I introduce myself too. And this is the RISD library behind me, Fleet Library at RISD, which is in this wonderful 1917 Beaux-Arts banking hall. And we've been in here since about 2006. I've been Dean of Libraries just for 2 years now. I was at the JCB from 2011 through 2014, I guess. And and then I was at another organization called the Newport Restoration Foundation. As Chet said, my background is as an art historian, but I've always had sort of one foot in museums and one foot in libraries. I'm a medievalist more or less. I worked on illuminated manuscripts from the Romanesque and Gothic period into the sort of Northern Renaissance. And so my PhD is on a 14th century English Psalter that's illuminated. And so, while I have sort of, was trained as an art historian, I always sort of applied that trade and skill to manuscripts and the book arts. So, and I wish I could say I continue to do so, but as many of you know, administrative tasks tend to take over your time in these kinds of positions. So this is a talk. I'm just going to change my screen now. I'm actually, like all of you, I am in fact at home, not in my library, or some of you. And so, and I'm going to just, let me, share my screen and then I'll get this going. Host disabled attendee screen sharing. So Chet, can you just check that to see if I think my co-host.
Rodrigo, ¿puedes abrir para que Margot pueda compartir pantalla?
Let's see.
Tú eres el anfitrión ahora. Tú lo tienes que hacer, Chat.
Yo.
Host disabled attendee screen sharing. So
now it should work.
Okay, let's try it again. Bueno. Okay, so I'm going to, let's see. So I also haven't done a slideshow in a long time. Let's try this. Okay, can you see everything?
Perfect.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. So just to say that this is a presentation I gave in August 2014. So it's been almost 6 years, or more than 6 years, I guess, at this point. And I haven't really done a whole lot since then. So I want to just make that as a caveat that you and I are kind of going through this material again together. My goal is to show you the sort of visual evidence that I accumulated when I was sort of struck by the amazing illumination of the Agnese Atlas, especially as I learned how poorly illuminated all the others were. So that's what inspired me to take this on. And so we're going to walk through it together. I show the wonderful cloud page because that was the first that sort of captivated my curiosity. Why these clouds? Why are the winds shown in you know, the gradient, you know, sort of white to dark skin colors? What, you know, the trompe l'oeil use of the framing device makes it look like a ceiling painting, the pearls, all of those things. We're not going to necessarily get to all of those, but that's what sort of got me interested. And then let's see if I can, now I've just got to figure out how I move through this. Okay. I'm going to, I know, you know, it's not necessarily a good thing to give all these spoilers, but I thought since I hadn't really done a whole lot since 2014, I thought it'd be useful to just give you sort of right up front the list of basic hypotheses that I was working with or I developed while I was working on the illumination and trying to understand both the iconography, first of all, and then try to situate it art historically. I would say I was much more successful in the end, sort of discovering some sort of new directions for studying the iconography than I was necessarily for the art historical context. I think there's some real good questions still there to answer and explore. So you all know the sort of bibliographic record for the manuscript, I'm sure, starting in the 19th century with the facsimile that was published by the dealer Frederick Spitzer, and then Wagner's dating of around 1544 up through, you know, the JCB's publications, the Italians in America and the Creation of America in 1980, and you know, through that whole history, bibliographic history, there's been this association with Charles V that we'll talk about. So my first hypothesis is that the illumination was added later than the creation of the Atlas. And that came from both the sort of heraldic and other visual and possibly circumstantial evidence. And, you know, no two of the manuscript atlases really look alike. And it does seem that many of them were taken away, purchased unilluminated, and then sort of tricked out later on by, and you know, other studios or you know, workshops. So first of all, I don't believe the patron was Charles V. Probably not even Philip II, but I will just, you know, here's my spoiler, and many, you might have, oops, sorry, you might have already come to this. I seem to have lost my cursor. Let me go back. That my hypothesis is that the patron or the person most directly involved was Martin of Aragon, the Duke of Villahermosa. So, and we'll look at that heraldic evidence in a minute. That at the time in 2014, I thought that the illumination was possibly done in Brussels, or at least in the Netherlands, looking at some comparisons like the triumphs of Charles V in the British Library, but also just understanding circumstantial evidence of where Martin of Aragon and Philip II were coinciding in the sort of various sort of northern campaigns at the time. It has been the traditional association with Giulio Clovio, the Croatian illuminator who worked in Rome and for other sort of ducal courts in Italy, that he might have had a hand maybe in the figure of Jupiter astride the eagle. And then the other illumination was certainly by a second hand. So there are at least two hands working in the illumination there. And I think that's a pretty straightforward analysis there. And then about the overworld map, the physical characteristics of the winds, I started to notice some good matches in, some of the 16th century, the Appian Atlas and other printed atlases, and was kind of looking at where I could find some connections there when I was working on this. I have not followed up on any of that really. But, I think really intriguing to explore now is this unusual presentation of the winds with the gradient of the light to dark faces, and whether that, at one time I was thinking, is that a reference to phases of the moon or perhaps the races of man? And I do think this idea of the races of man, and I know I've talked about this with Bertie Mandelblatt as well, that we both think that that's sort of it could be a really interesting direction to pursue. So that's it. That's the summary. And I'm happy to share. I think Chet might even have that list. I tried when I did come back to sort of look at this again, I kind of tried to download what I remembered most about the work I had done. So, and I hope that you'll stop and ask questions along the way if you have them. I'm going to try to just run through the slides pretty quickly and just give you the high level point that I think I was making with each of them. And then we can, I'd love to hear what you think. And if any of this is new, because, by now, perhaps you've already, found all of this. And so we'll see. And I'd love to hear about what you have found also. So just to start, here is the point to be made, that this is something extraordinary. This is an atlas that was treated very differently from the other Agnese atlases that have been cataloged by Wagner, and I think that the handful that have been discovered since. There are some other extraordinary ones in Russia, and there was one, I think, that the Rothschild was never recovered after World War II, that I'm not sure if that sort of made it into the other sort of documented volumes or not. But so that I don't think we need to belabor. And then again, just to see how that full page, to create the border that occupies the full page, and with the opaque sort of painting in the trompe l'oeil, gold sort of effect of a kind of view through a ceiling, is something rather extraordinary. So Charles V, Philip II, or somebody else? This is, I think, this is what I understand. When Chet asked me to speak with you, it did seem like the sort of Charles V association was something that is very much on everyone's mind. And I'll just run quickly through some of what I was seeing when I came to look at this in terms of the iconography. And I think you all know that the pages have been manuscript at one point was disbound. The bifolios are now flat on single cardstock. So it's the facsimile reconstructs that original. And I don't know if you have access to that, but that's a really good thing to work from. So these pages look kind of funny in how flat they are and not in the sort of codex orientation. Anyway, these are the facing pages. So you have the sort of dedication or dedicatory bifolio opening with this medal, a kind of trompe l'oeil medal with the portrait of Charles V that seems to be a copy of the Leone medal. I've got that in just in another slide, but just to see the orientation, and then there's the sort of or the sort of narrative scene of the creator giving or providence giving the universe essentially to a young soldier, whether that's Philip II or not, we can see. And then, of course, the inscription that does make the reference of providence to Philip. And then, of course, the arms of Castile and Aragon. And so a sort of compelling connection there. But the other devices in the corners seem to have gotten ignored through much of the analysis of the illumination up until the point that I was sort of investigating this. So we're going to look at that and see the associations. But one thing I want to point out too that doesn't often get mentioned are the broken columns that occupy a good amount of space above the sort of presentation of the arms, and whether there's a reference there to Charles V's columns and emblem, I think is worth paying some attention to. So there's the medal. It's really quite beautifully painted and rendered in this trompe-l'oeil effect, and it essentially evokes pretty convincingly the circa 1550 medal by Leone. So here is an interesting connection that I think might be useful if you haven't already kind of thought about this, is what does the presence of the medal say? What is the association? And I would argue that the choice of using a medal rather than a portrait from life, so to say, would indicate that there's a degree of removal. And whether that's temporal or physical or, geographical, I don't, it's, but it says that Charles is not here really, but here's something to stand in for him. And it operates in the same way, or why, where I kind of make that connection, a compelling sort of corollary is in this amazing portrait of Juana of Austria, and where she is remembering, she's holding the medal on this beautiful lace collar, which is essentially the same medal of her father. And it's from the paintings about 1570, so long after the death of Charles V. Here is, the daughter sort of remembering her father, and it's the opposite, it's the mirrored orientation, but it's pretty much the same medal that's being evoked there. And so, sort of thinking of the use of a medal as a kind of, I don't know, in modern language, we might call it the avatar of Charles V. He's remembered, but he's not there. And so I think when we come back to looking at the iconography across the page, we see the arms of Castile and Aragon, which are associated with Philip II, and immediately above them are these two broken columns. Is this a reference also to degradation, decay, absence? I don't know, I think it could be all sorts of things. I don't take anything for granted when it comes to when thinking about how these sorts of heraldic and emblematic sorts of borders are constructed. So if there's a broken column, I think there's some meaning to it, and and looking for the simplest association, it would be to the columns of that are emblematically associated with Charles V. And little preview on the left, I'm sure you've all sort of spent a lot of time with the triumphs of Charles V from the British Library, but they serve such a prominent framing role there. And I do think there are possibly some connections to these illuminated, the illuminated versions of the printed triumphs of Charles V. So, okay, so if we go back across the page, there is the medal again, and then the more naturalistic rendering of the illustration, I would say, of the inscription immediately below, which I have accepted the translation of Jean-Michel Massing from the circa 1492 catalog. But, you know, again, these things you can always sort of probably, there are variant translations out there, but I take it to be Providence to Philip, excellent prince, son of Charles the August. So it's that conveyance of the territories, essentially, to Philip. So whether this is, I mean, it definitely postdates the mid 1550s. By how much, I don't know. Is this sort of reminiscent, looking back from far, or is it proximate? So is it something that is happening, you know, is sort of documented relatively close to the time that that Philip receives the sort of responsibility for Spain and the Spanish territories? I don't know. So I just throw that out there to be considered. So here's Philip, just to evoke the person who also does not appear as a portrait or a medal in the manuscript iconography, but is referred to by, you know, symbolically, through the inscription, through the emblem, through the arms. And I think, you know, there certainly is plenty of reference to sort of military and the sort of martial engagements of Philip that are, you know, certainly very much that he's actively engaged in this later, the period of the later 1550s into the 60s. So, so here he is in his full armor, the portrait from the Escorial, Antony Moore, just to bring him in. And I, you know, this is also interesting to me, just the way that these kind of heraldic dedications appear. This was just a nice kind of comparison. I can't remember that I had a whole lot more to say about it at the time. I didn't find much else in my notes. I think it was just sort of a visual comparison to say, yes, this is how this is very close to how Philip appears in printed books, and when there is a dedication to him as under his very many titles of the time. And this is engraved frontispiece is from 1571 from a publication from Seville. So that's just coming back to see the whole sort of accumulation of emblematic symbolic evidence with certainly the association between Charles V and Philip II is very much present. But what are these things doing in the corners of the page? And so, you know, I start with lucamque, metumque, both light and fear. And so, I mean, various ways to interpret that. We'll see in a minute, and you've probably found this. I will say right off that at the time, I could not find the omnia dot, the other emblem. So there are two emblems, and I'm sure you know, they repeat over and over again, but the omnia dot. So I'd love to know if you've been able to find an association for that. But the lucemque, metumque, which you see has the thunderbolt, the bundled thunderbolts and fire of Jupiter, that is then sort of corporeally referred to in this amazing portrait of Jupiter astride his eagle, which is, you know, the finest illumination in the manuscript. And then in the borders for the Western Mediterranean, the Black Sea again, and you know, depicted in kind of variant ways, which is kind of interesting, sometimes with the motto, sometimes without. I mean, it clearly has, and here, you know, in the right border cartouche and then up above, it appears together with the omnia dot, whereas in other pages, it's just the lucemque, metumque, or the bundled thunderbolts. It's so there it is again. And then if I don't know if you had come across this yet or not, but there is Martin de, you're going to have to help me with the pronunciation. Is it Correa or is it Chet? How do I say it?
Gurria.
Okay.
Gurria. De Gurria.
Gurria. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Aragón. So this is an amazing portrait by Antony Moore and the 1560s. So that's rather a compelling kind of association, and seemed pretty straightforward. So there is, I think, little doubt that is accidentally there, and it appears in so many different contexts for Martin, here in the Roland Moy painting at the Ducal Palace. I don't know, I've got you all on the side here covering up the column base over here where, oops, of course, that, where in relief you find that the same emblematic device for him. So, and then again, I think the medal is, you know, wonderful evidence of the full, interesting sort of complement of heraldic and emblematic, you know, sort of information, where the lucemque, metumque is associated with the figure of Jupiter on the reverse of the the great medal of Don Martin from 1557. So. And there again, and you know, I would have loved. I wish, you know, it would have been so wonderful had the pose in the manuscript, you know, copied more closely that of the medal. So you imagine the illuminator sitting there with the medal, saying, "Oh, let me paint him just like this." He's clearly used another sort of pose for Jupiter, but but I think, you know, certainly evokes the device on the verso of the medal. So, okay, so that's that was sort of what I feel like at the time was the main contribution I was sort of able to make in terms of the what was known about the manuscript. I think that it really puts into question this sort of conventional association of the manuscript that goes back to the 19th century and all the way through to 1980 with the JCB catalog, the Italians and the creation of America, where, you know, the story was this was the absent father, Charles V, sending to his son an atlas for his education. I don't think that that is supported by the iconographic or art historical evidence at all. And I think more likely it becomes an interesting story of, one of Philip's great childhood friends and officers eventually in his military campaigns, having some connection to the decoration of the manuscript long after it was produced in Venice by Agnese. So, and this was just at the time, I kind of tried to download all the different, the chronology to try to think where could this have been made? What makes sense in terms of the movements of both Philip and Martin? And here in blue, I think is the area of overlap. So, and this puts Philip in the Netherlands, largely France, and that area of the world. It's the, the death of Charles along here, and then his funeral procession, and the wonderful print of that procession has Martin carrying his sword. Sorry. Oops. Right between the mourners that are carrying the scepter and the orb. So, he's not an insignificant figure in the sort of orbit of Philip and Charles, especially in the sort of when they are in the Netherlands, but also once everyone's sort of back in Spain as well. So I won't sort of go through all of this. This is probably well known by all of you. And I'm happy to share this, the slides with you afterwards too, if that's helpful. So, and it's not that, there are other sort of circumstantial pieces that make this not an improbable kind of connection. And, one being that there was, Martin of Aragon was a collector of metals and antiquities and had a lively correspondence with Cardinal Granvelle, which I think would be a great sort of archival resource to dig into, to understand better the, what a likely context might have been for the decoration of the Agnese Atlas, possibly. And so I just sort of connect them there, the Titian portraits with Philip as well. And, just sort of looking for some other kinds of comparisons. So here's a prayer book that was clearly associated with Charles V. It was later given as a gift to Martin de Gastoulou. It's now in the Morgan Library in New York, made in Brussels or Mechelen in around 1547 or after 1547. I can't, now I'm trying, I did not have specific notes about this. So I think that what I had included this for was to make the point of Charles's patronage of Netherlandish illuminators and sort of book workshops, things like that. So, he's a patron of manuscripts from the North. He was in the habit of giving these as gifts to ambassadors and other diplomats. And but when he is present, he's very much present. He has a direct role in the patronage or the commissioning of a manuscript. You often have, here he is actually in a portrait present. He's evoked both through emblematic and heraldic means, but also through naturalistic rendering of the emperor as well as patron. In a very typical sort of patron portrait would be included in a manuscript like this. So I think that's probably what I was trying to say with this comparison. So that's my sort of iconographic evidence. That's, you know, sort of what I wish I could have found. Can I ask, have you found who the omnia dot, the other emblem belongs to?
No,
That would be really...
the Agnese project through GeoPOM is just starting. So
good. So this is all good baseline evidence.
This is all good baseline evidence. Yes.
Okay, good. I'm happy that I can contribute to that. All right. So so the artist is you know, this is a really interesting problem. There's at least two hands when you look closely and really kind of apply your visual analysis skills, because on the left is this very finely rendered and very typical sort of use of gouache or egg tempera on vellum, the sort of stippling technique to build up shadow, light and shadow, and it has a very sort of distinct look to it that is in fact similar to the way that Giulio Clovio worked, but also we see it in other 16th century illuminator hands. Whereas on the right, you can see that the artist is working more in, you know, creating light and shadow through brush strokes that suggests a you know, sort of different training, different way of building up three-dimensional form. So it's just to say that there's at least two hands in the illumination. And when you're working in, you know, when you look at a sort of workshop setting, it's not unusual in manuscripts of this period to see that, you know, 2, 3 or more hands sort of finishing a single project. And again, in the some of the other figural renderings, you can kind of see the same difference happening here. It tends to be a little less three-dimensional in the right than in the left. And so the association with Giulio Clovio goes way back as well. Certainly, it would have made the manuscript a lot more valuable to have been able to claim that it was painted by Giulio Clovio, who really is the most celebrated illuminator of the Renaissance. He's, you know, he's named by Vasari. There's, I think I have coming up the wonderful portrait that El Greco did of him. And, you know, he came from Croatia to Italy at the age of 18 and joined the household of Cardinal Grimani, where he learned to paint and clearly had some real native talent. He eventually ended up in the household of Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, and this is the Farnese Hours that he's most often associated with. It's from around 1546, and this is when, you know, it's really the 1530s, 40s, where you see the sort of height of Giulio Clovio's production. But he certainly established a style. He had a large workshop. There were certainly many who learned to paint from him and from his style of rendering the figure in tempera, but also the sort of use of the classicizing iconography of sculptural borders and you know, classical devices and cameo, you know, the use of sort of trompe l'oeil cameo effects here. So this is, you know, this is sort of Giulio Clovio at his greatest in this double page opening from the Farnese Hours, which is in the Morgan Library in New York. And so, you know, it really is rightly, you know, celebrated as the height of sort of high late Renaissance manuscript illumination. And in fact, it's the Farnese Hours that Giulio Clovio is pointing to in this amazing portrait by El Greco from the early 1570s. So wouldn't it be wonderful if this was Giulio Clovio in the Agnese Atlas. I don't think it is, but I do think it's certainly informed by the sort of traditions that he established for border compositions and the painting technique as well, and we can sort of look a little into that. So this is just a nice comparison to these sort of the kind of framing devices, similar sculptural with crania and putti and and the sort of grisaille effect of cameos as well. So, but in the Agnese, it's a real kind of watered down version of those conventions. So, and but I would say that in the Jupiter painting is where we see, the legacy and very close to the soft, sensitive, very careful, stippled rendering that you find in the nude figures in the Farnese. And of course, you don't find very many nude figures, except in the classical borders of, of the Farnese hours, except in, of course, Adam and Eve. So, and there are some, that's a kind of good art historical comparison to make. And when you start looking closely, you'll see that the Agnese figure does not hold up in the same way as the figures in the Farnese hours. So could there be a connection instead to somebody like the illuminator of the triumphs of Charles V? And I don't know if you've spent very much time looking at these pretty amazing illuminated copies of prints by, let's just go there, of Dirk Kornhirt, who had engraved his plates after drawings by Martin van Heemskerk from the 1540s, I think is what it is. I think the drawings are are from around late 1540s. The prints are mid 50s. These illuminated presentation copies, there's some interesting new evidence suggesting that they could be actually much, much later into the 16th century. So we'll talk about that in just a second. Let's just go back though, because I think stylistically, there are some interesting passages that could suggest a connection. But it's not, other than that, I'm not sure exactly where to take this until we look at the sort of evidence of where these were likely made. So that's the Spanish expedition to the Americas. Do you all know these, the triumphs of Charles V? It's a really interesting sort of one of these sort of commemorative or sort of luxury commissions and it turns out that they were very likely commissioned for Prince Philip. So Philip, when he was, right, so the son of Philip II. They, for a long time, were dated sort of in the, I guess, sort of 1570s or so, 1560s, sort of closer to the time that the prints were dated. And it's, you don't see as much, you usually assume that something that's drawn serves as the original, and then the print comes after that. Well, this is, we have actually here the whole thing, the drawings, then the prints, and then the illuminations. And they're pretty fancy. They each have a cartouche that face them in Spanish, describing what's going on in the illumination. So they were clearly for a Spanish-speaking audience, and in this particular form. And most recently, they've been, and for a long time, they were attributed to Giulio Clovio. And Giulio Clovio has a very long life, so it's not, he dies in 1578. He's born in 1498, so he lives to about 80. I don't know how productive he was in the 60s and 70s, though. But more recently, I only just found this out because it had not been published when I was doing this work 6 years ago. These have been actually connected to a letter by the ambassador from Milan to Madrid. I forget his name, but from the court of the Duke of Urbino, from the court of Francesco Maria della Rovere, della Rovere, that there's a letter describing gifts coming to Prince Philip at the Escorial. And I'm sorry, I'm not saying that as you would, but so at the palace where the family is for the summer, escaping the heat. And it's a letter dated 1593, and it describes a book that illustrates essentially the accomplishments or feats of Charles V. And it's been very convincingly connected with these illuminations in the British Library. So that's really interesting because that takes it all the way to the end of the 16th century. And the artist has been identified as Simonzio Lupi da Bergamo. And this is all recent archival research in Florence done by the conservator at the Escorial Palace. So it's something interesting to follow up on. So whether this could possibly be connected stylistically or art historically to the Illuminator of the Agnese, I think is worth following up on. And this is one of the other panels of Charles amongst his enemies, this Suleiman, magnificent way over on the left, and some of the Western European dukes and popes and everything. So really interesting composition there. So again, this had a lot of unknowns around it until very recently, and you can see that the British Library dated it from 1556 to 1575. That's a big, wide range, and now it could be that much later is really interesting. And then again, there's the connection to the prints, and that's one of the cartouches. So interesting. Describing the expedition, and a little closer to the looking at the sort of stylistic analysis there. So finally, I then started to think about, could it be that in that period that where Martin and Philip coincide in Brussels or Antwerp, that sort of Netherlandish area, what's happening up there? Well, certainly there is all the great cartographic activity. There's also, but in terms of illumination, Brussels, where these great sort of print series are being turned into amazing tapestries. Brussels is, one of the artistic hubs of Europe at the time. Could the manuscript have been carried in the sort of entourage of Philip II or with Martin, or could it have been purchased there and then sort of tripped out as a gift? It's just something to consider and follow up on. But why I started to look at more at the sort of cartographic iconography around borders for the atlases, thinking maybe there's some evidence there that we could find to help identify some of the sources for the borders or the other iconography. And so the winds in the great Peter Appian world map here are really kind of interesting because they are similarly differentiated more along the lines of the ages of man, but that they're differentiated would suggest a kind of artistic sensibility that one could see sort of experimenting with other ways to differentiate the winds, rather than just, you know, straightforward, the sort of straightforward, every putti looks the same as the other in the other Agnese atlases, where the winds are framing the world map. So, so I just, you know, suggest that as a place to start, and to think about the sort of the long life that a lot of this kind of iconography had in the 16th century in Antwerp, and that sort of environs in the Netherlands as possible source material for some of the iconography. And different from what we're seeing in the sort of Italian, the Giulio Clovio sort of traditions that I think are evoked in the other borders. So again, it's sort of, you need to think about some kind of very cosmopolitan center, I think, when you're looking for where the manuscript was illuminated. So, and that's back to there, and that's just to split the scene and to sort of give some thought to that connection. And in fact, even in the sort of shaping of the sort of youthful faces, these nice big fat cheeks of the winds, there is a corollary in the engraved borders of the Appian Atlas. So that is what I have. That's what I can remember. And, you know, I hope that might help to give you some kind of points of departure, or, and, you know, points to challenge, interrogate, investigate. But, you know, I'd love to hear what you think. And if you saw, if anything rang, kind of anything sort of seems to correspond with what you might have been thinking about, or what you're starting to see in your own investigations.
Well, I do have a question, which is whether you had a chance, and I understand if you didn't, but whether you had a chance to see whether you had a chance to look at anything about Martin's library, and whether he had other maps in his collection.
Yeah, they're interesting. I did not get to dig. So this is, so here's where the kind of barriers happened for me, because I don't have Spanish. I think that there's a next level of investigation that has to happen in the archives and publications that you will need to, you know, be able to read with ease. And there is a publication of his collection of coins, of ancient coins and medals, that was produced in the 16th century, that, you know, he clearly was an avid collector, but I wasn't able to find out more about his library. I mean, there are these interesting letters with Cardinal Granvelle that I think need to be explored too. So just, you know, what else was he interested in? I couldn't get there myself, and I sort of, you know, ran out of time, but also reached my sort of limitations. In terms of skills to really go further myself. So, but I think I think there could very well be some very some really good material there to dig into.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Are there questions or thoughts?
Thank you, Margot. I was thinking, yes, about, I would like to see again the chronology you have shown to us,
Yeah.
because I would like to decipher well. So this particular atlas is different from other copies which are all around the world. So your point is that this particular copy has been illuminated by an artist in the Low Countries, when Philip, in a sort of coincidental meeting of the Duke Martín de Gurrea y Aragón and Philip II. Is that so? This is the first thing I would like to know. Yeah. No?
That was my hypothesis 6 years ago when I was first working on this. It was sort of a direction to consider that could be you know, a time and a place where this kind of elaborate decoration could have happened. You know, I think once you understand that the atlas is made at one time in one place, and that the decoration has nothing to do with that time and place, then it could be anywhere, you know, it's sort of like, so that opens up so many possibilities. I think, you know, it definitely postdates the ascension to the throne, or assumption of the throne to Spain. Right, I think the heraldry, if I'm interpreting it correctly, would suggest that it's after that for Philip II's arms. So then that sort of what's happening right after that? Well, that's the blue, and that's sort of and both Martin and Philip are there together, or whether they're together or not, they're in that part of the world. And they're not back in Spain until 1560. So
this is a sort of like the atlas was sort of repurposed by an artist. So which is something that happens a lot with a lot of art artifacts. I mean, with art devices, sculptures, like in some moment, the object itself is very, repurposed or has a new interpretation, sort of new interpretation with new historical meaning. So this could lead to a very interesting point, because we can sort of compare the Baptista Agnese atlases in 1544, more or less, with I don't know, 10 years after, or 12, or almost 20 years after, and see what was the reception of this same material in another context, in a different context. So, I mean, this hypothesis can enrich a lot the interpretation of this particular copy, and so this was my first question, and the second one is regarding the ruin, the broken columns. Because I love that one as well, and I realized that also we have this wall in which this officer or soldier is receiving the wall, but in the upper side of the wall there is also a sort of ruin in that wall. So you say that whether it can be a sort of decay claiming about the Spanish empire, monarchy, but also it could be only a sort of aesthetic style in which the classicizing motive of the ruin was kind of very fashioned at the time. I don't know. That's what do you think about this sort of? Is that a decay claiming, or is just a aesthetic?
Right. Well, absolutely. You know, certainly decay. Although, you know, this isn't really the era of the sort of folly. You know, you think about the sort of little follies that you see in sort of 17th and 18th century landscape that are sort of created to look like they're in little ruins. You know, I'm trying to think like what a corollary would be in the 16th century. Certainly there is the sort of, you know, new whole field of excavation happening in archaeology, you know, the sort of nascent archaeology where, yes, you know, ruins are evoked certainly in some iconography, and certainly the results of digging with all of the classical iconography of the grotesque and things like that come from that. So it is an interesting, is it just kind of romantic kind of evocation, or is it purposeful? Is it decay, or is it disillusion? The disillusion of the empire, at this time, or at least the fragmentation. I don't know. I mean, I tend to start from the premise when I'm looking at illumination in manuscripts that no choice is, that nothing's accidental, that there is potential meaning in everything. And maybe that's sort of old-fashioned Panofskian art history, but it's, I think that you sort of have to start with that premise, that there is, especially when so much else on the page has very clear, specific, emblematic, symbolic meaning, for the background of such a sort of large piece of the page has no meaning at all except to be sort of romantic framing. I think I find hard to buy.
Yes, no, I agree. And
so, but
for me too, the same.
Yeah.
Yes, I do agree. But I didn't want it to say like it was just a decoration without a specific significance. Instead, I was thinking about this argument that has been brought by Alessandra Russo about the new antique, the new as the new becoming of the old, So how the new world was seen through the lens of these classicizing literature. So to think about something old wasn't in fact to think about something that was falling, but instead about something that was rediscovered. And from that point of view, I think the ruin can also bring new significance. So that was the thought I was having when I saw that.
Well,
what do you think about
new life to the reign, perhaps, of Philip II, and maybe you could imagine then, Martin is the patron of the decoration. He's just made sure that Philip doesn't forget that this was a gift that he had made for him, or something, something like that. It's, that I still haven't quite I never sort of was really certain about the roles of each of the historical figures who are evoked by the symbolic material. So but I do think the repurposing is very interesting, as you say, repurposing, right? And that's not, it seems like there are several other Agneses that were perhaps taken away from the workshop in Venice, and used perhaps, or just, they weren't, used in the real practical sense, but used to communicate the information about the expanding world and the understanding of geography, that sort of thing. But and then later decorated large, you think probably for some special purpose, as a gift, or as a you would have to think that it has to be a special reason, and that's an interesting subgroup of these Agnese atlases, are the ones that have this sort of significant decoration that's added later. And that would, there are at least 2-3 others, I would guess. There are more, but they don't relate to this one in terms of style or iconography. So I think they were special in their own right, And so they were seen as something that would be an appropriate gift to, you know, that would be a diplomatic kind of gift. And then, you know, to then make it that much more special is to add the sort of individualized, you know, sort of decoration to it. And it could happen anywhere, really. Well, not anywhere, because not everywhere in Europe at the time had, you know, great, you know, workshops for illumination. But certainly places where you find Philip and Martin, there are great illuminators. So it's, yeah. No.
Can I make a question?
Ah, yes. Where's?
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is really very interesting. And well, I have a question related to these images that you presented about Charles V as the expeditions of, or also not the triumphs of Charles V
Yes.
that are in the British. Yeah. Do you think that they were perhaps made to remember the people in Spain, to make closer America to the people in Spain, as something, well, I know that in America, at least in New Spain, there was this tumulus, mortuary tumulus, that they used to make like, celebrating the funerals of the kings. Every time the king died, they like celebrated the funerals in America. And today displays this, like, it's called tumulo, where a representation, a physical one, to make feel the people in America that they had the king, actually. Even when Americans didn't know the king, they should feel the king close. So I wonder if this kind of images were made for Spanish to know about the, well, the triumphs of the king in America, actually. And well, it's just a question, but I found it very like important that you said that you don't take anything for granted. So related to this, I had this other little question related to this image that you presented in about a frontispiece of 1571, I think. I'm sorry that I had a problem with my connection and I just was starting to see the presentation in that moment. And it is like, I don't remember, but it is related to Peru. It's like a frontispiece that is talking about, I don't know if it's a map or something about Peru,
Yeah.
but in the, vignetta, in the, I forgot the word in English, vignetta, the cartouche or something, there is a little galley, and it's dedicated to Charles V. I know that the galleys were in the Mediterranean, but my question is about if it could be related to the galleys from Panama to Peru, because I have always had this question. I have read that there were, well, of course, the transportation from Spain to Peru was via the Channel of Panama. But apparently from Panama to the coasts of Peru, there were galleys. So yes, this one in the part, in the right part, lower part. So well, I don't think it is from Peru, but I was trying to make the most and ask you if you know something about it, if it could be possible that, well, a galley from Panama to Peru could be represented somewhere, if not here, somewhere else. And what do you think about this image of the galley here? Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting idea. I mean, I do have to say that was one of the pieces of the iconography here that I did wonder about, the maritime reference, not knowing really, because it looks very much like a, you know, a classical sort of Roman, or, you know, a galley of antiquities. And then of course, sort of personification there of, I guess it could be Ares, or I can't remember exactly which who that is in the cameo, but I tended
Athena,
to.
no?
Well, yeah, it could be Athena. You're right. Yeah, but certainly Athena in her most martial persona, persona. And so, and there's a lot of other sort of spoils of war that are referred to. So certainly that kind of military campaign is evoked in the kind of the choices of the sort of classicizing iconography in here. But whether there's anything sort of more practically evoked from the expeditions, to the Americas, I can't say with any kind of confidence there, except perhaps in the most general of ways. So, but it isn't interesting, and I think that everything does need to be looked at and considered in terms of that, the meaning. And could be many different layers of meaning to these devices that you find here. So, but it's a great puzzle, and I think you're all going to have a lot of fun. I can't wait to hear to hear what you find. So yeah.
Any other questions for Margot?
I have a very nice question that do you know another world map for these years that use black people? Because it's interesting, because for me it's the first. No, it's the world maps. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't have a reference immediately. I mean, you do in terms of the printed maps. I don't know, Chet, did you ever come across?
Yeah, so I actually gave a talk about wind iconography at a conference, I think it was last year, and I show several earlier maps that show the wind heads, some being Caucasian, others being black. So it was something that had a longish history to it.
Chet, the world map, the world maps.
Yes, world maps.
Okay, before Agnese or
before Agnese, yeah.
Okay.
Wow. Okay. That's great. So, well, that's going to be a good piece to add to the puzzle here.
Yeah.
So.
Very good.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Well, in that case, Margot, we want to thank you very, very much for taking the time to present this wonderful material to us. I think it was an absolutely essential starting point for the Agnese project to see everything you've done, all the work you've done, and to be able to benefit from it.
Well, you're all very welcome, and I hope if you have other questions, I'm happy. I realized, Chet, when I started to sort of look at things again, that I'd actually given Bertie all my physical files. And so I had to kind of reconstruct what I could without, sort of running and grabbing them. But, certainly happy to, if there are questions about what I've presented, happy to do what, answer them to the best of my ability. But I hope that you will invite me when there are presentations, as you all make, I'm sure, what will be really interesting discoveries to create a fuller picture of what just, where was this done and why? So it's gonna be, you're gonna have fun. So enjoy the journey.
Very good. Will do. So again, thank you very much, and that's a very generous offer to be willing to accept questions. I have your contact information if anyone wants to do that, and we will keep you apprised of any and all developments.
Thank you. That would be wonderful.
Margot.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Well,
Thank you.
I hope everyone stays safe and healthy. Okay. Bye-bye. I'm gonna.
Bye-bye.
It was
Stop my
great, Margot.
share.
Thank you. Very inspiring.
Well, you're very welcome. I'm glad you're inspired. And hopefully that'll
Yes.
put a little fire in the belly.
That's right.
Get out there and find what you need. Okay. See you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Take care, Margot.
You.
Ciao,
Bye-bye.
Chet.
Ciao.
Rodrigo.
Gracias, Rodrigo.
Ciao, Andrés.
Ciao.
Ciao.